Now we should be recording. Let me just make sure. Yes, we are. All right, so macros. So let's open this folder here, which I posted on Brightspace. And let's look at this first data set, which I have titled Data 1. And if you recall, this was the end result from our homework number 11. We had gotten it in a form where we had the ticker symbol, the SIC 2-digit code, the SIC industry, the actual name of it, the fiscal year, fiscal quarter of that fiscal year, change in assets as of the end of that fiscal quarter, change in liabilities for that fiscal quarter, net income for that fiscal quarter, and the quarterly return for that fiscal quarter. Remember that? We had that data set. So I just saved that. And if you recall, one of the questions I asked on homework 11 was to run a regression for each year, 2009, 2010, 2011. And I asked you to regress this variable right here on these three variables. And then the question was, in which one of those yearly regressions? So you had to run the regression just for 2009, then you had to do it again for 2010, which was a hassle, right? You had to go and change, you had to go and filter out just the 2010 years and then do the regression tool. So that's 10 different regressions, right? 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. Just 10 regressions. That's a hassle. And I think I asked, what's the coefficient on net income? I asked some question. In what year was the coefficient on net income the highest, or something like that? And we already determined that this regression wasn't really a useful regression anyway, so I'm not going to care so much about the interpreting the regression. But how could you answer that question with a macro? In other words, how could you get Alteryx to run those 10 yearly regressions without having to do any changes? You just set up one macro, you hit the button, and it runs all 10 yearly regressions. Does the problem make sense to you? All right, so that's what I'm going to show you. So there's the data. We know the years in this column. The possible years are 2009 to 2018. We already know that, right? Based on the way the data was. So here's what you do. I'm going to open this. I've already made the macro. I'm just going to walk you through each thing that I did. So to create this macro, you know when you first open up Alteryx, if you just look over here, before you click on any tool, if you look over here, it says workflow configuration, and we never really talked about this. But if you go to the second tab, workflow, by default, Alteryx opens up a standard workflow. So this is checked. So all I did was I checked macro, and I chose which macro I wanted, a batch macro. That's what I'm going to teach you today, a batch macro. I chose batch macro, and then I dragged and dropped tools onto this. So this is not a workflow. It's not a .yxmd. It's a .yxmc, which is the file extension for an Alteryx batch macro. And if you look at what the file looks like in the folder, you see how it's purple versus the normal workflow? This is .yxmc. This is .yxmd. You can see the file extension. Does it show it here? I guess it doesn't show the file extension here, but that's what it is. All right, let's walk you through this. What is this? So with a batch macro, the first tool you drag and drop onto the canvas is an input tool. And you find it in the, up here, in the, let's see, where is it? Interface. You find it in the interface category. Interface contains all those tools that you would use in a macro, either a batch macro, a standard macro, an iterative macro or a location optimizer macro. Don't worry about these other macros. Just think about right now batch macro. So you find the macro input and you drag and drop it onto the canvas. And this is what it looks like. This is the tool configuration for the macro input tool. Notice how it wants you to input some data. So you click text input and we'll edit data. And all we're going to do here, I'll make these columns bigger, is we just set up the general form of what we want, the general form of our data. Think about what we want. We want to regress. What's the problem? We want to regress. We want to run a regression. Return Q on these 3 other variables, right? That's what we want to do. We want to do that regression with our huge data set, but one regression for each year, right? So just in general, the problem is we want to regress a dependent variable on 3 independent variables. So title the dependent variable what it is in your data. You don't have to title it the same thing as it is in your data. You can just title this Y. You can title this X1, this X2, and this X3 if you want to. But then later on, as you'll see, then things might be a little confusing and you might not remember what you did. So if you just title, if you get in the habit of just titling these exactly what they are in the data, then that's a good practice. And then down here, just put anything, any numeric thing. So I just put a 1 in every row. I'm sorry, a 1 in every column. You can put any data as long as it's numeric because that's what we want to do as a regression, which is a numeric sort of thing. So you can put anything. So basically this is just telling Alteryx, and we hit OK. The input name, you can name it whatever you want. Usually just name it input. The anchor abbreviation is I is fine, and then show field map. Make sure you check the show field map box. If you don't check the show field map box, it can lead to confusion later on. That's important. Now, if you already had this data, already had this little stuff right here saved as a file, you could do file input and just upload it right here. But you're not uploading all the data right here. That's not where this is like a general form of what we want to do. Now, by default, it's a text input tool, so what if we look here, attach a select tool and change these 4 variables from their default types that are given to them by the text input tool. And I think the default type, is it int? Is it integer or is it string? If you're following along, you would know because you would have seen what the default type was before you changed it. What was it? Or byte. It's byte, isn't it? Yeah, sorry, it's byte. So the default type for the text input is byte. So change it from the byte to double. Okay. And then what do we want to do with this general form data? We want to run a regression, right? So drag and drop a regression tool, linear regression tool, which is in the predictive category. It's right here. Drag and drop it. You notice that above the select tool, there's a lightning bolt. Above the linear regression tool, there's a lightning bolt. That's just letting us know that we're in a macro. That's letting us know that this regression, it's not going to actually regress this data. So every macro, with every macro, this is the macro right here, we're going to have a corresponding workflow. And on the workflow is where we reference this macro. This macro just sets the stage. In theory, what are we going to do with the data that we're going to put on the workflow? So you attach a linear regression tool, give it a model name. We'll call it quarterly stock, to be really specific, stock price return predictors. And then check select the target variable, RETQ, and then the other 3 are the predictors. And then you would just attach a macro output tool from interface. But I put this extra filter tool in between because remember when you run a regression, what gets output? Several things get output. How to show you. If I go and open up, let's go and open up just so that you recall. Where's homework 11? Here's homework 11. And if I want to go ahead and just run this workflow, you see there's the linear regression running the 2009 regression. 2009, we regress return Q on this. But our macro is going to run all the years with one click. But if we just run this, what gets output? In the browse tool, lots of things get output, you remember? Coefficients were one thing, but then there are other things that are output. And so what I'm doing right here is I'm saying we only want the coefficients. That's all I want. It's just the coefficients. Let's go back and just run this homework 11. Let's run it. It's going to take a little bit because I'm going to hit run. It's going to take a sec. And you'll see from the regression output, if we hit the browser, you'll see what's output and you'll see what it looks like. And once you see it, that'll help you to realize why I put this tool right here in between if you just attach a macro output to this regression, it doesn't know what to output. So let's go back here. Let's look what was output. See? All this stuff, right? You see all this stuff? But all I care about from all this is just the coefficients part, which is everything. It's all of this. That's the only thing I care about. For each year, output this. I don't care about the type 2 ANOVA analysis. I don't care about the residuals. I don't care about the basic summary, and I don't care about, there's two more. I don't care about this right here, the basic diagnostic plots. All I care about is the coefficients part. You see that? Just the coefficients part right here. And so that's why in my macro, I went and attached this filter tool and said, only get the coefficients. This description variable there's two things with regression. There's description and report. And the description has coefficients, residuals, and all those things, and basic diagnostic plots, but I only want the coefficients part. So that's why I grabbed the coefficients. And then bring in a macro output tool, which comes from interface. Here's the macro output tool configuration. All you do is just give the output a name. Just call it output. In the anchor abbreviation, just call it O, always. Now, you're not going to actually run this. If you hit CTRL-R here or try to run this, it'll just give an error. You're not running this. Save. Oh, okay, whatever. So we're not running this. I'm going to get rid of this homework 11. We don't need this. Now what we want to do, that's the macro. Now what we want to do is make a workflow, which I've titled Regression Results by Year. And it's not finding it because, okay, hold on. I need to take all this stuff out of this zip folder. It doesn't like it when it's in a zip folder, so I'm going to Control-X, Control-V. It doesn't like it when it's sitting on my desk. Now let me save it. This is okay. what is happening here? Yeah, this is... It has to do with, I put it in here and then I put it out here and it's not liking it. Let's see. Let me do this. Let me X out. No. Let me X out. Let me open it from the desktop, not from the zip folder. There's nothing in here now. So let me open it from the desktop. All right. What changes? Did I make any changes? No, I didn't really make any changes. The only thing I did was I went over here to this edit and I made these columns bigger so you could see what was in them. That's why it asked me to save any changes. That was the only thing I did. But yeah, so we're not going to run this. Now we need to make a workflow. So the workflow I called regression results by year. Let's open this. All right. First thing you do in this workflow is you bring in the data that you actually want to run the regression on. The data that you actually want to run the macro on. So that's this data. And I've got it titled wrong here. So the data actually is data 1. It's on my desktop. Sorry, it's right here. This data. All right? And then, so that's what you should just have a blank workflow with just the data there now, right? You don't have anything else. And then on your white space workflow, just right click right now. Go to Insert, go down to Macro, and insert the regression batch macro that you've already done and saved. This thing right here. So you should have made this, saved it, and then in here, right click, insert, macro, regression batch macro. And when you do that, you should see this thing right here, right? So you should see it. Let's undo this connection, and then undo the browse. So you should just see this thing right here floating around, right? It's just sitting there. So what you're going to do, you see the I here stands for input. And you see the upside down question mark here. The data is what you're going to attach to the input side of the macro. That's the data that's going to be fed in this form. The data will come in the same form as this. That's the data that's coming into the macro. And then it's going to, and then the upside down question mark are you want to iterate this macro based on the upside down question mark, based on the year, right? So you're going to feed the years into this, and you're going to feed the data into the input node here. That's what you're going to do. And what it's going to do is it's going to look at this. This is the macro right here. Every time it sees this, it's going to go and do this to the data. It's going to run the regression based on the years that you fed into the upside down question mark. So let me attach the way it should be. First, I have a select tool here, and I changed the 4 variables of interest here to double from vString, because if you left them as vString and it tried to run regression in the macro, it's going to say I can't do a regression with. So that's why that select tool is there. Now, what about up here? What are these things? Well, up here, I'm grabbing out the years. So I have a unique tool. I get the unique fiscal years. And then I change. I didn't change any data types here. You don't necessarily have to change. Fiscal year Q up here is vString, and down here it's vString as well, which is fine. So this select tool is not needed. and then you attach a browse tool so that you can see the output of the macro. And then let's run it. Now this is going to take a sec because it's going to run for each year that regression with this data, which was a lot of data, right? It was like 123,000 rows. So if I hit run, what does it say? Oh, I'm sorry, never mind. I've forgotten a huge piece. Click on the macro. Here's the tool configuration for the macro. This is very important. I forgot a huge piece. So the control group by, this is what you're putting in. What are you iterating on? We're iterating on the year. We want to do the macro once for each year, correct? Don't we want to do this macro right here one time for each year? So that's what the control group by field is. It's the field that you want to iterate the macro on. So that's going to be the F year Q. We have the unique F year Qs right here. So we should have a column of just 2009, 2010, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. 10 numbers. And then the input, that's coming in down here. The control group by field has to also be in the input, or else you see? And then so choose the right input group by field. It's F year Q. Now it doesn't have to be named the same thing. You could call it year up here, but alternatively, if I don't want to bring the years in like this, I can get rid of this if I don't want to use this. I could get rid of this and just use a text input tool and type the years in if I already know what the years are. If I already know what the years are, I could call this year and then just type in here 2009, 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018. But why would I do that if I can just use a unique tool and it's going to pull those out anyway? That's why I use a unique tool. But you can do it this way if you want to. Keep in mind, though, if you use text input, it automatically saves it as a data type byte, and so you're going to have to change it back. The data type in the control group by field has to match the data type of the same variable in the input. And over here, it's a vstring, right? F year Q is vstring, so you're going to have to take a select tool and change the data type to, actually it's int16 because I typed years in there, whatever. But change it to the same, like this. So either way, you want to use unique or you want to use this. I think unique makes more sense. And then go back to your macro. Now I got to change it, right? Because I changed. Now the control group by is year, right? I named it year up here. Year, see? And that matches with F year Q in the actual data. That's the same variable, right? And then you see the questions right here. Click on questions. And this is where, you remember in your macro over here, at the input tool, where I said check the show field map box, and if you don't check it, you could mess up? Well, when you check the show field map box, what that affects is when you go to your workflow, and you go to your macro, and you go to the questions, it matches, it does a field map for you. So you match this RETQ, and this change in ATQ, and this change in LTQ, and this NIQ, guess what those are? Those are from your macro. Those are these variables in your data, right? Right here that you named. I named that thing that. I could have named it Y, and I could have named this X1, X2, and X3 if I wanted to, but I named them the actual names of the variables in our data, and that's what the field map does. So you go here to the questions, and you just find the variable that matches. So if this was Y, I know Y is RETQ, but I named it RETQ to make it easier. Does that make sense? So it's easy to match up. Change in ATQ is change in ATQ. I could have named that X1, right? This could have been X2 and X3 whenever I was actually making the macro over here. Make sure that the variables are a double in the data, and also to make sure they're double in your macro. That's why I use the select tool and change them to double. You see that? Otherwise, it's not going to work. And now you can run it. CTRL-R. And wait, it's going to take a sec. Your computer might take longer than mine, but it's going to take a little bit. So you run the actual workflow. You don't run the macro. You don't run the .yxmc file. You run the .yxmd file that references the .yxmc file. You do not have to have this .yxmc file open while you run the .yxmd file. You don't have to have it open in Alteryx, I don't think. Is this making sense? A little bit? I know it is a little bit hard to get your mind around, but we're going to do 3 other examples. This is the first example. Regression by year. So you can do a yearly regression. Guess what? In our data, remember we had various 2-digit SIC industries? We could do a regression for each 2-digit industry, where we just group the data by SIC 2-digit industry and just regress. Now that's going to take longer because there's a lot more than 10 SIC 2-digit industries. You're going to have to do how many of our SIC 2-digit industries are represented, that many regressions. But the macro will do it. So if you want to know if the relationship between these independent variables and the dependent variable is different depending on which industry they're in, then you could do this macro and run these different regressions by industry. This type of thing in Microsoft Excel, forget about it. I mean, you would have to do way more than this to do the exact same thing in Excel. You have to go to the back end of Excel, VBA. Have you guys ever heard of VBA? It's like the behind Excel, and you have to do a lot of programming, worse than Python even more than Python programming. And you get the same thing, but this is so easy, right? Did it finish? Oh, it's not done yet. 92%. 95%. All right, now it's done. Now here's the output. Look at this nice, pretty output. There's 2009's regression. We regressed return on these 3 independent variables. There are the coefficients. There's the intercept. There's the coefficient on x1, x2, x3. Standard errors, t-value, or t-statistic, p-value. We already talked about that this regression wasn't a good regression anyway. It didn't make any sense. But anyway, there's the regression in 2010. There's the results for 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017, and 2018. 10 years. So that's the macro. All right, everyone go with the first example? Let's do example number 2. I'm actually not going to save. Actually, I like using the... That's fine. We'll save it. Save that. Here's example 2. This .back file, if you ever wondered what this .back file is, you can always delete that. You don't need it. So something really similar. We're going to use the same data, that same data we were just using, data 1, but instead of doing regression by a year, we're going to get we're going to get the Pearson correlation matrix by year. The correlation between these 4 variables. The pairwise correlation is 4 variables. It's going to be a 4x4 matrix for 2009, 10, 11. Pearson correlation matrix. So here's the macro. On the canvas, go to workflow. On a blank canvas, open up, go to new here, new workflow. On a blank canvas, then open up workflow, change it to macro, change it to batch macro. Then bring in a macro input tool, which again is in the interface category. Right here, it's in this category, macro input. Drag and drop it onto the canvas. Name it input, give it anchor abbreviation of I. That makes sense. You don't have to give it those things, but that makes sense. Make sure you check the show field map. and then edit data, it's going to look just like it did before. We have these 4 variables, and I want the pairwise correlations between these 4. And the data on these variables is numeric. And here's the general form. Just put the number 1 or the number 2 or the number 15 or the number 5076. It doesn't matter what number you put there. In other words, it's just like a placeholder. It's just a general form of the data. It's not string, it's numeric. So I just put the number 1. You can put 0 there if you want to, 0 for every column. Just put some number for every column. You do have to put something. You can't put A, B, C, D, E though, because you got to put some number. All right? So that's going to be coming in. That a form of something looking like that is what's going to come in. And then we're going to drag and drop a Pearson correlation tool, which is that in data investigation? Yes, it's right here. Drag and drop that onto the canvas. Let's click it. We want the correlation for these selected variables. So that'll give a matrix, right, with the pairwise correlation between each possible pair. If there's 4 variables, it'll be a 4x4 matrix. Check the calculate correlation down here, or you could do calculate covariance. Then drag and drop a macro input tool, which is also in the interface category, onto the canvas and connect it. And just call it output and then anchor abbreviation O. And then save this. Save it as whatever, I call it Pearson correlation macro, but save it as whatever you want. It's a .yxmc file. Now we got to make the .yxmd workflow. So I've already made it. It's right here. Right here. Bring in the data. That same data we just used, which I have referenced the wrong thing here. Let me change it. It's called data 1. It's on our desktop right there. Bring in the data. Use the select tool and make sure you change the variables that you're interested in that are going to be running through the macro. Make sure you change them to the right data type, so double. Now we want to do this, calculate this Pearson correlation matrix by year. So we can bring the years in using a text input, just like I showed you earlier, or we can use a unique tool, right, to pull out the unique years. I changed the data type here of year to string, vstring, because the same year variable down here, which is going to be the F year Q, is vstring. Make sure those data types align. Then once you've done that, you need to bring this onto the canvas. So to get this on the canvas, again, you hover over the white part, right-click, insert, macro, and find your macro, Pearson correlation macro, and check and click that there. I don't need to because I already have it. Then connect your control group by field to the upside down question mark, and connect your input data to the input data node. Now go to the tool configuration for your macro. In the group by field, choose the right control group by field. So it should be year. That's what it was called up here. And that should correspond to F year Q in the input data. So we're running this macro by year. That's what we're doing. We're grouping by year before we run this. The data that comes into the Pearson correlation tool will only be data for 1 year. That's the point here. And those years are specified right here. In fact, if we know this data has all the 10 years, right? But if we only want to do 3 of those 10 years, then so suppose we only want to do 2009, 2010, 2011. Well, then we can just get rid of all these if we want to. And it'll only find 09, 010, and 11 in this data and only do the macro for those years. And all the other years it'll leave alone. Does that make sense? So let's try it this way. All right, so year, and then questions is very important. Go to questions and make sure the fields that you've chosen in your macro line up with the fields in the data. So over here, the fields we named were We name this RETQ. We name this change in ATQ, change in LTQ, and NIQ. It's a best practice to name these things exactly what they are in your data. And it makes it easier. But if you would name this Y, X1, X2, and X3, then make sure you check Show Field Map. That way when we go over here, when we go to questions, this would say Y, and we know that Y, so that's the name of the variable in the macro, but what's the name of the variable in the data? It's RETQ, and this would say X1, but it's actually changing ATQ, and so forth. Does this make sense? And then run it. Attach a browse tool before you run it. That way you can see the data after it's run. Otherwise, you won't be able to see anything. If you run without a browse tool and you click the O, you can't see anything. So that actually did it very quickly. Look at the browse tool. Now, we only did 3 years. Remember, we only did these 3 years. So this is where I can make this output look prettier, but that is that's the Pearson correlation matrix for 2009. Notice it's a 4x4 matrix. I mean, this actually is just this part right here. This is the Pearson correlation matrix for 2010, and then this is the Pearson correlation matrix for 2011. We could do, it's pretty obvious to you, hopefully, that we could do some formatting changes by, before we hit the browse tool, we can attach some tools here and change the format of what this looks like. Right? We could add a blank row in between rows 4 and 5, between rows 8 and 9. That way it delineates the years better. But here, just stacks them all on top of each other. What if we wanted to do it for all 10 years? We would just go back into here, go back, type in all the years we want. And then just go back here and run. And it should. Might take just a slightly longer because it has to do 7 more years than it did in the first run. But there they are. There's all 10 years. Again, we can make the output format a little better so we can see. There's 2009's Pearson correlation matrix, 2010's Pearson correlation matrix, 2011's. And we can verify, so each year is 4 rows, and there's 10 years, and there's 40 records. So we can verify that it's doing it right. Notice how the numbers change slightly. Like the correlation between net income and change in ATQ in, what's this, the 3rd year? 2011. This is 2010. This is 2011. This is 2012. This is 2013. So the correlation between NIQ and change in ATQ in 2013 is different than the correlation between NIQ and change in ATQ in 2012. And that's different than the correlation between those same 2 variables in 2011. And that's different than the correlation between those same 2 variables in 2010 or 2009, whatever. I may have messed up the years. Does that make sense? So it's actually doing it. It's actually doing it by a year. It's pretty powerful. That's the second example. All right. Let's do third example. Just delete this .back file. You don't need it. It's just a temporary file. It just stores what you temporarily did. But you don't need it. The next one we're going to do is this multiplication batch macro. You'll notice it looks a little different. So start with a blank canvas, go to workflow, go to macro, go to batch macro. Once you've done that, then attach a macro input tool from the interface category. In this category, grab a macro input tool. Now, the data we're going to work with here, let me go back up. We're going to work with data 2. So we're done with data 1. The next two examples are going to be using data 2. Let's open data 2. This will look familiar from something we did earlier in the course. Remember when we did that little mini case, databases for accountants? We took those 4 files, orders, customers, order details, and products, and we merged them together to form a final database. This was the database that we created from the merging of those together. Now suppose, here's our data. All right? Now suppose we want to know the after-tax profit for each order. After-tax profit. But the tax rate varies by state, and we have some other file where we have for each state its tax rate. Now I realize here's an example where you can do this without using a macro. You can just make a new field which has the tax rate for each state, right? And then you can do exactly what I'm about to do without using a macro. But just to illustrate another way to do macros, I'm going to do this with using a macro. Does that make sense? So in another file, or a file we create, we have each state that's in this data set. And beside that, so the first variable is the state abbreviation, so NV for Nevada. And then the second variable is the state sales tax rate. We have that in a separate file, okay? And I want to calculate the after-tax profit for each one of these rows. Because each one of these rows represents a particular product that was sold to a customer, right? We have almost pretty much everything we need. We could calculate the before tax profit. Well, we already did that, right? That's just the revenue minus the cost. That's this minus this. That's the before tax profit. But the after tax profit is going to equal what? The before tax profit multiplied by 1 minus the state sales tax rate. That gives the after tax profit, wouldn't it? All right. So don't save. So attach a macro input tool. Now in the edit data, what's going to come into this? The only thing we're going to change is we're going to change the profit. We're just going to take profit and multiply it by 1 minus the state sales tax rate. So just title it profit. You don't have to title it profit. You could title it Y or Z or whatever you want to title it, but title it profit, make it easier. That's what's going to come into this. Or technically the before tax profit is what's going to come into it, but whatever, profit. And then just put some number here because we're going to do a numeric operation on this profit. Then bring a formula tool, create a new variable called after-tax profit. Which would just be equal to our variable profit times 1. 1 is a placeholder. What's going to tell us that 1 is allowed to change are these things up here. 1 is the multiplier, but we want 1 to be the 1 we really want to be 1 minus the state sales tax rate, correct? And so we want that to change as the state changes, right? But so I just put 1 here as a placeholder. And you can put anything. You can put 2300. It's just a placeholder. There's nothing specific about that particular 1. Make it double. Now, go grab a control parameter and attach it, or put it up here. Control parameter. Enter a label for it. We're going to call it multiplier. That 1 is going to be the multiplier. And we're going to allow that to change. And then attach an action underneath it. And then it'll attach to this. And the default is it updates the value. and then update value. We're going to be doing it on this expression right here. That's the expression down here. Right here. So we're going to be doing it on that expression. Replace a specific string. Replace the string 1. So 1 is the thing we're wanting to replace. What are we going to replace it with? 1 minus the state sales tax rate, which will change depending on the state. But that's how you create this new variable after-tax profit, which is profit times some multiplier, and the multiplier is going to be allowed to vary. This is how you make that happen. You have to attach a multiplier and an update and an action tool. Then attach the macro output. Call it output. Give it abbreviation O. Save your macro. .yxmc. Now open a brand new workflow. So go to File, New, and here's the workflow that you'll create. So get your data. Now it was called data 2, right? So I got to go change this. Data 2. Use the select tool and make sure you change. The only thing that's changed this profit variable from vstring to double, because that's the thing we're going to use. Now, here's a text input tool, and I've listed for each of these states, I've grabbed the state sales tax rates. These states are all the states that are in here. There could be, this right here could be a subset of the states that are in here. But I'm not sure if you put a state in here that's not in here, if it will run without error. I'm not sure about that. You could try it. We could try to add a state down here and put a number. But I think it'll run with an error. I think your control group by field, it has to be a subset of your input group by field. It can't be a superset. But anyway, so all the states that are represented in the data 2 file are these states. And for each of those states, here's the state sales tax rate. So then I attach a formula tool, and I create a new variable 1 minus the sales tax rate, which is just 1 minus the sales tax rate in this, and I change it to double. Now you can bring your macro, so you right-click, insert, macro, find your multiplication macro that you created right over here, this thing. And so right-click, insert, macro, multiplication macro, and then click that, and then this thing will come up on your canvas. Connect this to the upside down question mark. Connect your data to the input data node, and then choose the macro tool so that you can configure the macro tool. The control group by field is the state, and that's the same variable in the input data. We called it state right here, see, state, and then down here it's called state, I think, yeah, right there, called state. So, and then the questions, choose a field. This field at the top, this profit right here, that'll be whatever, where it says right here profit, that'll be whatever you called it right here. We called it profit. So right here, we called it profit. So that's what it'll show right there. And then find the variable that corresponds to that profit variable in your data, which is also called profit. And then down here, choose field multiplier. What are we going to multiply it by? Now the macro says multiply profit by 1, but that 1 is just a placeholder. And these two tools are what tell the macro to let that placeholder update. And what are we going to update that 1 with? This 1 is just a placeholder. What are we going to update that 1 with? Well, when you go to the macro here and you go to questions, we're going to update that 1 with this 1 minus the sales tax rate variable that we created here. Attach a browse tool and run. And if we look, here's our data. And here's our after-tax profit. And you can verify that it did it correctly. So if we're in the state of California, we should be taking the profit times 1 minus the California state sales tax rate to get the California after-tax profit. But if we're in a different state like Colorado, we should be taking the profit times 1 minus the Colorado state sales tax rate to get. So it's pretty cool, isn't it? This is how you do a multiplier type macro where you just want to update one value. Now I realize you can do the same thing without using a macro, right? It's not that hard. You can just use some of the tools we've already learned, and just with a workflow you can do it. But this is how you do it with the macro. Now, but the regression thing, you can't do that without a macro, and the Pearson correlation, you can't do that without a macro. And what I'm about to show you, you definitely can't do without a macro. So that's example 3. Can we move on to example 4? Right, let's do it. Example 4 is really cool, in my opinion. So example 4, what example 4 enables you to do is it enables you to take a bunch of data. Imagine the data was inventory. It's just a huge database, a data set of inventory. You're auditing a company and it's all their inventory. But the inventory is scattered. Some inventory is located in warehouse A. Some inventory is located in warehouse B, and so forth. So this, what I'm about to show you, is a way that you can take a random sample of inventory from each warehouse. You just run the macro, and it tells you for each warehouse which items you're supposed to look for. It's a random sample. Does that make sense? Think about it like that. But we're going to run this. We're going to run this macro not on I don't have an inventory data set. We're going to run it on our original data here, on data 1, because it's a big data set. Remember data 1? What does it have? About 123,000 rows or something? 123,047 rows. So we're going to run this macro on this data set, and what we're going to do is I'm going to create a new variable called batch number. The first 1,000 rows of this I'm going to call batch number 0. The second 1,000 rows I'm going to call batch number 1. There's 123,047 rows. So how many batches will I have? The first 1,000 will be batch 0. Then batch 1 will be the next 1,000. So we're going to have 123 batches. And you can think of those batches as like separate warehouses. And then from each batch, I'm going to write the macro, grab 10 random rows from each batch. In other words, it's going for the first 1,000 rows, it's going to grab 10 random ones. For the next 1,000 rows, it's going to grab 10 random ones, and so forth. And it's going to put those 10 random rows all together into one data set. Do you see how this would do what I was saying with the inventory? It would randomly sample from each warehouse. It will do the exact same thing. As long as you have a variable warehouse, A, B, C, D, and you have 123 of them, it'll do exactly the same thing. As long as each item of inventory is labeled into its correct place. If you're a company that you just have one warehouse, you just got a bunch of stuff in that one warehouse, then you can also use this to just randomly sample from that. But you already know how to do that. That's easy. Just use a random sample tool. But what if stuff is scattered around and you don't just want to grab a random sample of all the data set. You want to grab a random sample of parts of the data. A random sample of this part, then a random sample of this part. Does that make sense? How do you do that? without doing many different workflows, one for each random sample. You don't want to do that, right? You want to use a macro. It'll do it all at once. Hopefully you see what we're doing. So literally this macro will take the first 1,000 rows. The end result, it'll grab 10 random ones from the first 1,000. It won't pick from any of the other rows. Only the first 1,000, it'll grab 10 random ones. Then from the next 1,000 rows, it'll grab 10 random ones from that. Then from the next 1,000 rows, it'll grab 10 from that. That's what the macro is going to do. So let's open it up here. It's called random sample macro. So make the macro. You know how to do that by now. Go to workflow, macro, batch macro. Drag and drop an input. Edit the data. Here I just put tick for ticker symbol, and it will become apparent later why. And since this isn't a numeric variable, I just put a non-numeric character. Now what we're going to do is we're going to use this random percent tool. So grab a random percent tool and drag and drop it. Random in records. Choose 10, or how many ever you would like to choose, depending on your context of what you have to do. But for this, we're going to use 10. Now, keep in mind, as this gets bigger, it takes longer for the macro to run for a given level of data. So if your level of data, our level of data is 123,000 rows, but if your level of data is 10 million rows, as this gets bigger, the macro just takes longer to run. And then use a macro output tool, and then save it. And then make the workflow, random sample workflow. Now, I bring the data in, which it's called data 1. I need to rename it here, or I need to select the right thing, or else it's just going to run with an error. And what I'm going to do is take that data, and like I had said before, I'm going to make the first one. I'm going to make a variable called the batch number. And the batch number is going to equal 0 for the first 1,000 rows, 1 for the next 1,000 rows, 2 for the next 1,000 rows, and so forth. But to set that up, first, record ID tool. You remember the record ID tool? It's just a tool that gives us a new variable, which is the row number, so that we can use it. Now then use a multi-row formula tool. We're going to create a new field called the batch number. Make it type double. Values for rows that don't exist. Make it 0 or empty. Don't group by anything. Don't group by anything. And then this is the expression. So we're going to take our row number and we're going to divide by 1,000. So when our row number is between 0 and 1,000, or let's say between 1 and 1,000, including 1, when you divide that by 1,000, you're going to get some number between 0 and 1, right? And you take the floor of that number. It takes the biggest integer that's smaller than that number between 0 and 1. So you're going to get some number 0.8, and the floor of that's 0. It's the biggest integer that's smaller than that number. When your row number is between 1,001 and 2,000, when we divide that by 1,000, you're going to get a number between 1 and 2. When you take the floor of that number, you're going to get the integer 1, right? So don't you see how this makes the first 1,000 rows, the batch number is going to be 0. The next 1,000 rows, the batch number is going to be 1. The next 1,000 rows, the batch number is going to be 2. In fact, let's just run that so you can see it. I'm going to delete this these connections here. Just delete these connections and just run this so you can see I know it's going to give an error because of that, but let's just see this, just so you can see what it looks like. So here's our row number field that we created with the record ID tool, and then here's our batch number. The first 1,000 should be 0. When we get to row 1001, that should have batch number 1. Actually, row 1000 also has batch number 1. Fine. Technicality there. We could change this expression to make sure that that's actually a 0, and then it starts with 1 here. But you get the idea. Yeah, it makes sense that that has to be a 1 as well. But and then the next ones are 2s and then 3s, and for every 1,000 rows we change batch numbers. And of course it doesn't display all the data here, see, because there's a lot of data. So you see what that's doing? Now what I did then is I grabbed the unique tool, attach this to the unique tool, and the unique tool, we want to find the unique batch numbers, change the data type to double, and then let's delete this connection just so you can see the output from this unique tool. It's just that there's that many batches, 0 through 123. Does that make sense? All right, now bring the macro onto the canvas by right-clicking, insert macro, random sample macro, and click that. And the macro will pop up. To the upside down question mark, attach this. To the input node, attach the data. And then let's see what we choose here. We want to group by batch number. So the control variable here is batch number, and then there's a batch number down here in the input. The only question is the batch number here is double, but the batch number down here is not. Oh, it is double, right? Because we created it right here, double. We made it double. Yep, so it's double. Fine. And then questions. And now here it doesn't matter. Tick is the variable I called right here. But we're not even using the ticker variable. We're just using the record ID variable. So I said call tick, let tick be the same as record ID. Choose field. What's tick? It's record ID. And so what it does is for each batch number, now each batch number represents 1,000 rows, right? Or technically 999 for the first batch, whatever. Each batch number represents 1,000 rows. So for each batch, it does this. It brings those 1,000 rows into the left side here and does a random sample. And how many rows does it take from that 1,000? It takes 10 random rows for each batch. You see? Attach a browse tool. I also attached a sort tool. What do I want to do here? A sort batch number in ascending order, whatever. Let's do this. Let's hit run. Now this may take a sec. Pretty quickly. And let's look at the output. Oh, I put the batches in ascending order so you could see. So there's 1,240 records displayed. And that makes sense. There should be 1,230 records displayed. If there's 123 batches, and each batch we choose 10 random rows, there should be 1,230 records, correct?
This is zero batch?
The zero batch, there's actually 124 batches, right? Yeah, 0 through 123, that's 124 batches. So we need to change something to fix that. The total rows in our data set is 123,047, correct? I'm pretty sure. 123,047. This is how many rows are in our data set. The first 1,000 we called batch 0. How did we end up with 124 batches total? We should end up, the last batch number should be 122, shouldn't it? This is just a small thing right now. We can figure this out, but what do we need to change back here to? So we don't need to make any changes here. The change we need to make is somewhere here. It's something in here. Anyway, you see it in general what it does. I could figure it out, but I don't want to take the time. Let's have a look at it again. So I put batch number out here. Yeah. Do you see these 10 records? Those are 10 random rows from batch number 0. The first 1,000 rows were labeled batch 0, right? And those 10 rows are 10 random rows from that first 1,000. You can verify that each of those is in the first 1,000 rows. The next 10 rows are 10 randomly chosen rows from the next 1,000 rows. Those are 10 randomly chosen rows from batch 1. And so forth. So hopefully you can see that this could actually be really useful to pick out random samples from subsets of your data. Just to find the right subsets. I may have messed up on defining the right subsets. I'm using batch number as the subsets to find the subsets, and maybe I messed up a little bit, but does that make sense? Hopefully this concept, what I did here, you can use and just change it to your context, I think, pretty easily. All you have to do is define the subset of data you want to take random samples from. Here it's batch number. But for you, you might already have a variable like warehouse number. Where's my inventory? And for each row each row in your data set is an item of inventory. And one of the variables in that row is warehouse number. And so, you may have 20,000 of those items that are in warehouse A. And 1,658 of those items are in warehouse B. But you could use this to take a random sample. Now, if the warehouses don't have the same amounts of inventory, instead of taking a random number of records, you could take a random percent of records. That way it adjusts to how many items are in the warehouse, right? If there's 10 items in a warehouse, you don't want to take a random sample of 10 of them because that would take all of them. Versus if there's 20,000. So maybe instead of 10, you choose 10%. Then that adjusts. If there's 20,000, you're going to grab 2,000 random ones. If there's 1,000, you're going to grab 20 random ones, right? Or 200 random ones. 200 random ones, right? So I could have done that here, but I didn't need to because each batch has 1,000. They're all equal, right? So there's no need to do percentages. But you see what I mean? You can definitely use this for all sorts of things. So you may want to save. Definitely, they're all on Brightspace, all these files. Save them and keep them on your computer going forward so that you don't have to try to figure out again, well, how did I do that? Because it might be kind of hard. That's all I had for today. So if you have any questions, you can ask them. Otherwise, have a great one, and I'll see you on Thursday. Yes, sir? Yeah, I'm actually going to put it up. That would be really useful. I think it turned out pretty well with a couple little hiccups. But then you could pause it, and go on your computer and make sure you can follow along more easily. So I'm going to put it up. I want to put it up on the YouTube channel.